Okay, so medieval pregnancy. Right off the bat, you're probably thinking it was like, oh, they just popped out babies all the time. And yeah, there's some truth to that, but the real story is way more complicated. Think about it. Pregnancy is hard, childbirth is dangerous even now, and adding in things like infant mortality, economic hardship, and maybe not wanting a bazillion kids, well, suddenly that image of endless medieval nurseries seems kinda simplistic, doesn't it? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So tonight, we're going to deep dive into something people really don't talk about. We're going to talk about sex, specifically how they tried to, control it in the Middle Ages. Think of this as kind of a historical detective story. We're sifting through the evidence, old medical texts, religious writings, court records, and even folklore to piece together a picture of how medieval couples grappled with family planning. It's not always pretty, and it definitely challenges some of our assumptions about the past, and frankly, sometimes it's kind of contradictory. Now imagine you're a peasant farmer in, 1340. Your life is, let's say, challenging. You're working from sunrise to sunset. Your diet is pretty basic, and life expectancy, not great. Adding another mouth to feed, another body to clothe, is a huge deal. It's not like you can just pop down to the store for more bread. Each child is a risk to your family's survival, a risk to your wife's health, and maybe a risk you just plain don't want. But it's not just the peasants. Even nobles, with their fancy castles and silk robes, had reasons to want to space out their families. Dynastic succession, inheritance, keeping the family fortune intact. All of these things played a role. What did these folks actually do? That's where it gets interesting and a little murky. There were no drugstores selling birth control pills, of course. No convenient IUDs. So what options did they have? Did they even have options? Was there an understanding of where babies actually came from? Turns out, yeah, kind of. One of the biggest problems we run into when trying to understand all this is secrecy. For obvious reasons, sex, especially non-procreative sex, was a taboo topic. People didn't exactly write detailed how-to manuals on contraception, and even when they did, let's just say the info wasn't super scientific. A lot of it relied on superstition, old wives' tales, and a healthy dose of wishful thinking. And it's important to remember that information, like everything else, was largely spread by word of mouth. That information tended to be women's information, held within families or the local wise women. But that also makes the information hard to find centuries later. Another puzzle piece, the church. The Catholic Church was a massive influence in medieval life, dictating everything from what you ate on Fridays to whether or not you could lend money with interest. So what did the church have to say about sex, marriage, and babies? Well, predictably, things got complicated. The official line was pretty clear. The primary purpose of marriage was procreation. Anything that interfered with that was, sinful. But even within the church, there were different interpretations and different degrees of enforcement. So as we delve into this topic, we're going to have to grapple with these contradictions. We're going to have to consider the perspectives of different social classes, different religious beliefs, and different levels of knowledge and access to resources. We have to challenge our modern assumptions about sex and family planning. It's going to be like trying to solve a really old, really complicated jigsaw puzzle, where some of the pieces are missing, some are broken, and some might even be from a completely different puzzle altogether. But even with all those challenges, we can still get a fascinating glimpse into the intimate lives of medieval couples and discover the creative, sometimes desperate, ways they tried to navigate the complexities of sex, marriage, and reproduction in a world very different from our own. And you know what? It's probably going to surprise you. It certainly surprised me. I mean, I knew people weren't just sitting around hoping for babies, but the ingenuity, The sheer effort people put into controlling their own fertility. It's kinda mind-blowing. So get comfy, because this is going to be a wild ride. But before we dive into the details of how they tried to prevent pregnancy, it's vital we talk about the context they lived in. We're going to explore the medieval mindset regarding all things naughty, starting next time with the medieval mindset, attitudes towards sex, marriage and children. I know you want the juicy stuff. But like, you can't understand the solutions without understanding the problems first. It's important to set the stage properly. We need to understand how these people viewed sex, marriage, and the role of children in their lives before we can appreciate the challenges and the choices they faced. So buckle up. It's going to be educational and maybe a little bit scandalous. Just don't tell the church. Alright, settle in, friends, because we're diving headfirst into something a little different. To truly understand why medieval couples did what they did, or didn't do, wink wink, we have to get into their heads. And trust me, it's a fascinating place to be. So let's talk about the medieval mindset. What did they actually think about sex, marriage and children? Now, before you conjure up images of stuffy old monasteries and perpetually pious peasants, remember that the Middle Ages was a long period of time, and ideas shifted dramatically across centuries and social classes. This isn't some monolith of thought, okay? We're painting with broad strokes here, hitting the highlights, but always remembering the nuances. Think of it like this: we're looking at the highlights reel of medieval beliefs. Okay, so first off, sex. Let's get one thing straight, or maybe not straight, haha. The church wielded a lot of influence. Officially, sex was for one thing, and one thing only: procreation. Anything else, technically sinful. Pleasure for pleasure's sake. Nope. Consider that a gateway drug to all sorts of other naughty behaviors, and anything outside of marriage, huge no-no. Like eternal damnation, kind of no-no. We're talking fire and brimstone level disapproval. But, and this is a big but, human nature exists. So while the church was preaching restraint and procreation, the reality on the ground was, well, a little more complicated. Think about it. You're a peasant. Life is hard. You work sun up to sundown, you're surrounded by animals doing it, your living space is cramped, and your future is uncertain. Abstinence isn't exactly top of mind. Plus, let's be honest, the church wasn't always the best role model itself. Hypocrisy was, shall we say, not unheard of. This created a tension that everyone was aware of. Now, let's talk marriage. Marriage was huge, economically, socially, and spiritually. For most people, it wasn't about romantic love, alright? Sorry Disney, it was about survival. It was a business transaction, a partnership, a way to secure your future and ensure the continuation of your family line. Land, inheritance, alliances, these were the driving forces behind most marriages, especially amongst the nobility. We're talking about strategic alliances forged through matrimony, not candlelit dinners and sonnet writing. Peasant marriages were often less about grand strategy and more about practical survival. Two families uniting to share resources, work the land together, and ensure there were enough hands to keep things going. Love could happen, sometimes did, but it wasn't exactly the point. It was more like a pleasant surprise if it happened. Though, for those of you who are romantics, even if love wasn't the primary goal, it wasn't like it never existed, okay? Age at marriage is another interesting thing to consider. We often picture medieval people marrying super young, like 13 or 14. And while that could happen, particularly amongst the upper classes, it wasn't necessarily the norm for everyone. Peasant women often married later, in their late teens or early 20s, simply because they needed to be strong enough to handle the physical demands of marriage and childbirth. The same would apply to many men, as well as they needed to come into possession of land or skills that would adequately provide for a family. And what about children? Well, children were incredibly important. They were labor, they were security, and they were your legacy. In a world with high infant mortality rates, having lots of children was seen as a necessity to ensure that some would survive to adulthood and carry on the family name. Think of it as hedging your bets against a very grim reality. A lot of kids meant that at least a few would stick around and help you in your old age. Plus, they were seen as a blessing from God. More children meant more grace upon the family, at least in theory. But again, the reality was more nuanced. Raising children was expensive and time-consuming, especially for peasant families where every mouth to feed meant less food for everyone else. So while children were valued, there was also a very real economic pressure to limit family size. At least for some, it's a balancing act. A delicate dance between religious ideals, economic realities, and personal desires. Another consideration is the incredibly high mortality rate for women during childbirth. Ponder this: every pregnancy was a gamble, and a serious gamble, with the odds often stacked against the mother. This created a very different attitude towards pregnancy than we might have today. While children were seen as a blessing, pregnancy itself was viewed with a mixture of hope and dread, a dangerous undertaking with potentially fatal consequences. You can imagine that the pressure to continue having children would be immense, but the dread of what could happen during pregnancy would always be lingering in the background. And finally, we need to acknowledge the sheer uncertainty of life in the Middle Ages. Famine, disease, war, these were constant threats that could wipe out entire families in an instant. This created a sense of fatalism, a belief that life was largely beyond your control. You did what you could to survive, to protect your family, but ultimately, you were at the mercy of forces much larger than yourself. This fatalism likely influenced attitudes towards family planning. If you couldn't control whether your children lived or died, why bother trying to control whether you had them in the first place? A fair, if difficult, thought. So that's a snapshot of the medieval mindset. A complex mix of religious doctrine, economic realities, and social pressures. It's important to remember that these beliefs were not static. They changed over time and varied across social classes. And as we delve deeper into the methods medieval couples used to avoid pregnancy, it's crucial to keep these underlying attitudes in mind, because ultimately their beliefs shaped their actions, and their actions shaped their world. Okay, so let's talk about the church in the Middle Ages. Now I know what you might be thinking. Yeah, church stuff, snore. But stick with me, because it's actually super interesting, especially when we're talking about, well, not making babies. The church was like the central authority in basically everyone's lives back then. They dictated everything from what you ate on Fridays to how you should conduct yourself in the bedroom. And when it came to sex and procreation, their message was, shall we say, a little complicated. Officially, the church was all about procreation. Think be fruitful and multiply, straight from the Bible. Marriage was seen as a sacred union, ordained by God, and its primary purpose was to create more little Christians. Children were a blessing, a sign of God's favor, and a way to ensure the continuation of the family line. Makes sense, right? But here's where things get a bit murky. While they were all for having kids, the church also had some pretty strong views about the evils of lust and the importance of controlling your earthly desires. Sex, even within marriage, was seen as inherently sinful, a necessary evil, tolerated only for the purpose of procreation. Basically, you were supposed to grit your teeth, do your duty, and then feel really, really guilty about it afterwards. Fun times. One of the key doctrines influencing this was the concept of concupiscence, which is basically a fancy word for lustful desire. St. Augustine, a super influential theologian, really hammered this home. He He argued that ever since the fall of man, our desires had been corrupted, and that sex was inherently tainted by this fallen nature. This idea, that sex was inherently sinful even within marriage, had a huge impact on the way people viewed their own bodies and their relationships. So on the one hand, you had the church telling people to have babies. On the other hand, they were also telling them that sex was sinful and that they should try to avoid it as much as possible. Talk about a mixed message. This created a real tension for medieval couples. How could they reconcile these conflicting ideas? How could they fulfill their religious obligations to procreate, while also striving for spiritual purity? Well, one way they tried to reconcile this was through the idea of marital debt. This basically meant that if one spouse wanted to have sex, the other spouse was obligated to comply, even if they didn't feel like it. It wasn't about pleasure or mutual desire, it was about fulfilling a duty. Refusal to fulfill marital debt was considered a sin. So if your partner was feeling particularly, enthusiastic, you couldn't just say, "Not tonight, honey, I have a headache." You had a religious obligation to perform. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so if they were so hung up on procreation, why didn't they just encourage people to have as many kids as possible? Well, here's another contradiction. The church also recognized that having too many children could be a burden, especially for poor families. They understood that it could lead to poverty, starvation, and even infanticide, which was, of course, a major sin. So while they officially condemned any direct attempts to prevent conception, they also acknowledged the reality that some couples might need to limit the size of their families. This created a sort of grey area where certain practices, like abstinence during certain times of the month, or even coitus interruptus, which we'll talk about later, might have been tolerated, even if they weren't explicitly endorsed. And then there's the whole issue of clerical celibacy. Priests, monks, and nuns were all expected to remain celibate, to abstain from all sexual activity. This was seen as a way to dedicate themselves fully to God without the distractions of earthly desires. But, let's be real, it wasn't always easy to live up to that ideal. There were plenty of scandals involving clergymen breaking their vows of celibacy. Hypocrisy? Maybe. Human nature? Probably. The church also had some pretty specific rules about when it was okay to have sex, even within marriage. For example, sex was forbidden on Sundays, during Lent, during Advent, and on other holy days. That's a pretty significant chunk of the year. The idea was that these were times for spiritual reflection and devotion, not for earthly pleasures. This meant that couples had to navigate a complex calendar of permitted and forbidden times for sexual activity, adding another layer of complexity to their reproductive lives. And of course, we can't forget about the power of confession. Medieval Christians were expected to confess their sins to a priest regularly, and that included sins related to sex. Imagine having to tell a priest about your less than pure thoughts or your attempts to avoid getting pregnant. The threat of confession and penance must have had a significant impact on people's behavior, at least for some. So what's the takeaway here? The church's views on procreation were complex and often contradictory. They were all for having babies, but they were also deeply suspicious of sex and concerned about the potential burdens of large families. This created a real tension for medieval couples, who had to navigate a confusing landscape of religious obligations, moral anxieties, and practical realities. It's like, go forth and multiply, but also feel really bad about it the whole time. And in this environment of mixed signals, it's maybe a little less surprising to find that people were finding ways to, well, maybe not quite ignore, but subtly work around the rules, which is exactly what we're going to dive into next. Alright, settle in friends. We're diving into something really fascinating now. The secret knowledge of medieval women, specifically when it came to, well, controlling whether or not they got pregnant. And it's important to remember that in a lot of ways women were the doctors back then, especially for other women and children. Now, when we talk about women's knowledge in the medieval period, we're not talking about a formal university education. Nope, what we're talking about is a body of information passed down, mother to daughter, midwife to apprentice, neighbor to neighbor, over generations. It was practical, experience-based knowledge, often closely guarded, and sometimes even feared by the male-dominated institutions of the church, and later, emerging medical schools. This knowledge encompassed everything from treating everyday ailments, to managing childbirth, and yes, to preventing or terminating pregnancies. And a huge part of this was herbal remedies. Think of your garden, or maybe the woods nearby. Medieval women saw a pharmacy there. They knew which plants could soothe a cough, which could heal a wound, and, crucially, for our topic today, which could affect the female reproductive system. Let's talk about some specifics, shall we? And this is where things get really interesting. And let's be honest, sometimes a little bit iffy. Because remember, these women weren't working with scientifically tested pharmaceuticals. They were using what they had, often with a mix of faith, observation, and sometimes just plain guesswork. One of the most commonly mentioned plants in historical texts related to this topic is pennyroyal. Pennyroyal was believed to be an emmenagogue, meaning it could bring on menstruation. The idea was, if a woman's period was late, pennyroyal could help restore it. Now, here's the crucial thing, in the medieval mind, a late period was often equated with an early pregnancy, so stimulating menstruation was seen as a way to, well, end that potential pregnancy. But pennyroyal is a tricky one. In small doses it might be relatively harmless, maybe. But in large doses it can be toxic, even deadly. It can cause liver damage, seizures, and organ failure. So, even though it was widely used, it was also incredibly dangerous. And let's be honest, dosage information wasn't exactly precise back then. Take a handful, wasn't exactly scientific. Then there's savory. Similar to pennyroyal, savory was also thought to be an emmenagogue, and again, the same risks apply. It's hard to know exactly how effective it was, and even harder to know how safe it was. Another plant that pops up is rue. Rue was believed to have both emmenagogue and abortifacient properties. Abortifacient, in case you aren't sure, means it can induce an abortion. The difference here is the thought that rue was a stronger medicine than many of the others, with a more direct effect. Again, it came with risks. Rue can be toxic in high doses, causing gastrointestinal distress, kidney damage, and even death. And we can't forget tansy. Tansy was another herb often mentioned in connection with menstruation and pregnancy. Again, it was considered an emmenagogue, and potentially an abortifacient. And you guessed it, it's also toxic in high doses. The active compound in tansy, thujone, can cause seizures and neurological damage. Notice a pattern here. Many of the herbs used for pregnancy prevention or termination were also potentially poisonous. This is one of the really tragic aspects of this history. Women were often forced to choose between the risks of unwanted pregnancy and the risks of using potentially dangerous herbal remedies. It was a desperate situation, and the choices they made were often incredibly difficult and dangerous. Beyond these well-known herbs, there were likely countless other plants used, depending on the region and the specific knowledge of local women. Some texts mention things like parsley, juniper berries, and even certain types of cabbage as having abortifacient properties. The effectiveness of these is, of course, even more questionable. Now, it's really important to stress something here. We're not advocating for the use of these herbs today. Modern medicine has come a long way. These herbs are dangerous, and there are much safer options available now. This is about understanding the past, not repeating it. It's also important to remember that not all women used these herbs to terminate pregnancies. Some women may have used them to regulate their cycles or to manage other reproductive health issues. The line between menstrual regulator and abortifacient wasn't always clear-cut in the medieval mind, and the intentions behind their use could have varied widely. And finally, it's worth noting that this knowledge wasn't just about plants. It also included things like specific massage techniques, dietary recommendations, and even certain types of physical activity that were believed to affect the uterus. But the truth is, the effectiveness of these methods was probably pretty low, and the risks really high. Medieval women were playing a dangerous game, relying on knowledge that was often incomplete, inaccurate, and potentially deadly. So what can we learn from all of this? Well, for one thing, it highlights the desperation that many women felt to control their own bodies and their own fertility. It shows us the lengths they were willing to go to, even in the face of significant risk. It also reminds us of the importance of safe and accessible reproductive health care. These women didn't have access to that, and it cost them dearly. It also underscores the value of traditional knowledge, even when it's not scientifically validated. These women were keen observers of the natural world, and they developed a deep understanding of plants and their effects on the human body. While their understanding might not have been perfect, it was often all they had. Alright, so we've established that medieval couples were pretty keen on avoiding unwanted pregnancies. But how did they actually do it? Well, let's dive into some of the early methods, specifically focusing on barrier methods. Think of these as the medieval version of condoms and diaphragms, although way less effective and way more interesting. First up, pessaries. Now, a pessary is basically anything that's inserted into the vagina to, well, do something. In this context, we're talking about concoctions designed to block or kill sperm. And the ingredients? Oh boy, are they a wild ride. We're talking everything from, well, dung. Yep, you heard me. Crocodile dung was a popular choice, especially in ancient Egypt. The alkaline nature of the dung was thought to be spermicidal. Charming, right? But hey, desperate times, desperate measures. Imagine that first date conversation. So, what do you do for a living? Oh, I collect crocodile byproduct for medicinal purposes. But it wasn't all poop, thankfully. Other ingredients included things like honey, which is naturally acidic and could create a less than hospitable environment for sperm. Then there's acacia gum, which when fermented produces lactic acid, a spermicide we still use today. So the medievals were accidentally onto something there, even if they didn't fully understand the science. Beyond those ingredients, other pessaries involved plant extracts, resins, and even metals. Saffron, rue, and various other herbs were ground into a paste and mixed with things like wine or vinegar before being inserted. The acidic environment was the key, but the effectiveness was, let's just say, highly variable. The consistency of these pessaries also mattered. Some were solid, like a small plug, designed to physically block the cervix. Others were more like a thick paste, meant to coat the vaginal walls and create a chemical barrier. The application process itself must have been quite the experience, especially considering the lack of modern hygiene and applicators. Now let's talk about sponges, sea sponges, specifically. These were actually a pretty common form of contraception throughout history, from ancient times all the way up to the 20th century. The idea was simple: soak the sponge in a spermicidal substance, like vinegar, lemon juice, or even those herbal concoctions we just talked about, and then insert it into the vagina to block the cervix. The sponge acted as a physical barrier, preventing sperm from entering the uterus, and the spermicidal substance, well, hopefully killed any sperm that managed to get past. Again, the effectiveness was far from guaranteed, but it was better than nothing, especially when combined with other methods. The advantages of sponges were that they were relatively easy to use and could be reused at least for a little while. You can imagine the medieval instructions: wash thoroughly after each use, and maybe don't share. However, hygiene was a major concern. Imagine constantly inserting a damp sponge into your vagina in an era without reliable sanitation. Infections were almost certainly a common side effect. Ouch. And then, of course, there's the removal process. Let's just say things didn't always go according to plan. Retrieval strings could break, sponges could get lost, and, well, you can imagine the awkward conversations with the local healer. Now, beyond pessaries and sponges, there were other attempts at creating physical barriers. Linen cloths, shaped and soaked in various solutions, were sometimes used as a sort of makeshift diaphragm. These were probably more common among wealthier women who had access to finer fabrics and could afford the time to prepare them. There's also some evidence suggesting that beeswax or other pliable materials were used to create cervical caps. The idea was to mold the material around the cervix, creating a physical barrier. But again, this would have been a very imprecise and likely uncomfortable method. It's important to remember that these methods weren't exactly advertised in the local medieval newspaper. Knowledge about contraception was often passed down through women, from mother to daughter, or within close-knit communities. It was part of a body of traditional knowledge that was often kept secret, both because of social stigma and because of the church's disapproval. And speaking of the church, their stance on contraception was complicated, to say the least. While officially condemning any interference with procreation, the Church also recognized the realities of medieval life, including the economic pressures that made large families a burden. This created a sort of grey area where some forms of contraception were tolerated, at least in practice, even if they weren't explicitly approved. But back to the methods themselves, the effectiveness of these early barrier methods. Let's just say it's not exactly up to modern standards. We're talking failure rates that would make a modern OBGYN shudder. But in a world without reliable alternatives, these methods offered a glimmer of hope, a chance for medieval couples to exercise some control over their reproductive lives. It's also key to remember the cultural context. These weren't just medical practices, they were interwoven with beliefs about the body, about sexuality, and about the power of women. Certain herbs were believed to have magical properties, and the act of preparing and using these contraceptives could be seen as a form of empowerment, a way for women to exert agency in a society that often denied them control over their own lives. So the next time you reach for your birth control pills or grab a condom, take a moment to appreciate the incredible advances in reproductive technology and spare a thought for those medieval couples diligently preparing their crocodile dung pessaries and hoping for the best. It wasn't pretty, but it was their reality. And in its own strange way, it was a testament to human ingenuity and the enduring desire to control our own destinies. Alright, so let's talk about coitus interruptus, which, fun fact, is basically the oldest form of contraception we know about. Seriously, people have been doing this, or at least trying to do this, for millennia. And it was by far the most common method used in medieval Europe. I mean, think about it. No pills, no condoms. Well, not really. We'll get to some of the attempts at those later. No IUDs, just pulling out. Now, before you picture a bunch of medieval couples laughing hysterically about near misses, let's be clear, this was serious business. Having too many kids could be a disaster, especially for peasant families. More mouths to feed, more hands needed in the fields, but also more potential for disease, more competition for resources, and more stress on already struggling mothers. So while the church preached against interfering with procreation, more on that religious pickle later, the reality of daily life often forced people to find ways to limit their family size. So why was coitus interruptus so popular? Well, for one, it didn't cost anything. Zero. Zilch. Nada. You didn't need to buy special herbs, construct elaborate devices, or consult with a cunning woman. All you needed was, well, a cooperative partner, a little self-control, and some seriously good timing. And let's be honest, those last two probably weren't always readily available, were they? It was also something men could control directly. In a society where women had limited autonomy over their own bodies and lives, coitus interruptus at least offered them some influence, even if indirectly. A woman could, presumably, pressure her husband to do it, or at least make her wishes known. Though let's be real, the power dynamic in most medieval marriages probably wasn't exactly conducive to open negotiation on this topic. Now for the really fun part, how well did it work? Short answer, not great. Long answer, still not great, but maybe slightly better than nothing. The problem, of course, is that pulling out requires perfect timing and a lot of self-control. And even then, there's pre-ejaculate, that little bit of fluid that can escape before the main event. And guess what? It can contain sperm. So even if a man managed to withdraw perfectly every single time, there was still a risk of pregnancy. Also, let's be real for a second. It's probably not the most satisfying way to have sex, is it? I mean, talk about pressure. Imagine trying to enjoy the moment while also constantly monitoring your body and anticipating the big O. Talk about a mood killer. But despite all its drawbacks, coitus interruptus was the go-to method. Why? Because again, what other options did they have? And also because, well, people believed it worked. Or at least they hoped it worked. And honestly, sometimes hope is all you have. Now you might be wondering, did they know about sperm back then? Did they understand how pregnancy actually happened? The answer is, kinda. Ancient physicians, like Galen, had theories about seed from both men and women mixing to create a new life. Some medieval scholars built on these ideas, but the actual science of reproduction was still pretty murky. They knew sex was involved, obviously, but the details were fuzzy. This lack of understanding probably contributed to the inconsistent use of coitus interruptus. If you didn't fully grasp how pregnancy worked, you might not be as diligent about pulling out, or you might blame other factors when it failed. You know, maybe it was the evil eye, or perhaps God wanted us to have another child. It's also worth pointing out that the effectiveness of coitus interruptus probably varied depending on the couple. Some men might have been better at it than others, some women might have been more fertile than others, and some couples might have simply gotten lucky or unlucky, depending on your perspective. And here's something else to consider: record keeping. We don't have a ton of reliable data on how often medieval couples used coitus interruptus, or how successful they were. Most of what we know comes from church writings, which, unsurprisingly, tend to portray it as a sinful and ineffective practice. But those writings are biased. They're not exactly objective scientific studies, are they? So while coitus interruptus might not have been the best method of pregnancy prevention, it was the most accessible, the most affordable, and the most widely used. It was a gamble, for sure, but for many medieval couples, it was the only game in town. And when the stakes were as high as the future of your family, you played the hand you were dealt, even if it was a bit of a bluff. So next time you hear someone complain about the inconvenience of modern birth control, maybe take a moment to appreciate the options we have. Because trust me, medieval couples would have given anything for a little more control over their reproductive destiny. And who knows, maybe in the next section, we'll find out about what, if anything, they did instead. Alright, settle in folks, because we're diving into one of the most natural ways medieval couples might have spaced out their pregnancies. I'm talking about breastfeeding, and specifically something called lactational amenorrhea. Now I know, lactational ameno, what now? It's a mouthful. Basically, it's nature's built-in contraceptive. Let's break it down. Lactational refers to lactation or breastfeeding, and amenorrhea means the absence of menstruation. So lactational amenorrhea is the temporary infertility that can happen when a woman is exclusively breastfeeding. Think of it as a sort of pause button on ovulation, a little break for the body after the intense work of pregnancy and childbirth. How does this work? Well, breastfeeding, especially frequent and intense breastfeeding, sends signals to the brain. These signals, in turn, suppress the hormones needed for ovulation to occur. Prolactin, the hormone responsible for milk production, plays a huge role here. High levels of prolactin can interfere with the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH, which is kind of the conductor of the reproductive hormone orchestra. No GnRH, no luteinizing hormone LH, and follicle-stimulating hormone FSH, and thus no egg release, in theory at least. Now here's where things get really interesting when we think about the medieval context. Modern medicine tells us that lactational amenorrhea is most effective as a contraceptive when a few conditions are met. Number 1, the mother needs to be exclusively breastfeeding, meaning the baby gets all its nourishment from breast milk, no supplemental foods or formula. Number 2, she needs to be breastfeeding frequently, usually at least every 4 hours during the day and every 6 hours at night. And number 3, she hasn't had a period since giving birth. If all these boxes are checked, the chances of getting pregnant are significantly reduced, something like less than 2% for the first 6 months postpartum. But medieval life wasn't exactly a laboratory-controlled study, was it? Their understanding of hormones and ovulation was, well, let's just say it wasn't as detailed as ours. They didn't have the science to know why breastfeeding might delay pregnancy, but they definitely observed the connection. Many medieval women would have understood, through generations of oral tradition, that breastfeeding could provide a period of relative infertility. However, we have to remember the realities of their lives. Exclusive breastfeeding in the modern sense was likely rare. Babies were often given other foods early on, things like bread soaked in milk or gruel, especially if the mother's milk supply was low or if she needed to return to work quickly. Malnutrition among mothers was common, which could also affect milk production and therefore the effectiveness of lactational amenorrhea. Plus, night feedings weren't always guaranteed due to the demands of farm labor or other household tasks. And let's not forget the big one, periods could return unexpectedly, even while breastfeeding. This variability meant that lactational amenorrhea was far from a foolproof method. Still, for many women, it might have provided a longer period between pregnancies than they would have otherwise experienced. Think about the implications. In a society where large families were often the norm, and where women faced significant risks associated with repeated pregnancies and childbirth, any method, even an imperfect one, that could extend the time between births would have been valuable. It could give a woman's body time to recover, improve the survival chances of existing children, and perhaps even give the family a slight economic advantage by spacing out the demands on their resources. Now, historical sources don't always explicitly state medieval women breastfed to prevent pregnancy, but there's plenty of indirect evidence. For example, some medical texts of the time recommend breastfeeding for extended periods. While the primary reason given was often for the baby's health, the potential contraceptive effect wouldn't have been lost on observant mothers. Also, artwork and literature sometimes depict women breastfeeding older infants or toddlers, suggesting prolonged breastfeeding was practiced. This might have been driven by various factors, including tradition, lack of other food options, and yes, possibly a desire to space out pregnancies. It's also worth noting that the Church's teachings on breastfeeding, while primarily focused on the mother's duty to nourish her child, could have inadvertently supported the practice of extended breastfeeding and thus contributed to lactational amenorrhea. The Church emphasized the importance of natural processes, and breastfeeding was certainly seen as one of the most natural things a woman could do. So while it's impossible to quantify exactly how effective lactational amenorrhea was as a form of pregnancy prevention in the Middle Ages, it almost certainly played a role. It was a natural, readily available, and often culturally supported method that, even with its limitations, could have given medieval women a degree of control over their fertility. It's a reminder that even in the absence of modern medicine, people found ways to navigate the challenges of reproduction, using the knowledge and resources available to them. And if nothing else, it gave medieval parents a few extra months of relatively uninterrupted sleep. or as uninterrupted as things could get with a newborn in a drafty, medieval house. Alright, let's drift into a slightly different corner of medieval life. A corner that might surprise you. We're talking about abstinence. Now, before your eyes glaze over, stick with me. This wasn't just about individual choices, it was woven into the very fabric of medieval society, driven by religious observances and social customs. Think of it as a sort of built-in, sometimes accidental, method of family planning. The church, as we've already touched upon, held immense sway, and while its stance on procreation was, shall we say, complicated, specific periods of abstinence were explicitly mandated. Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter, was a big one. Imagine, no hanky-panky for over a month. Then there was Advent, the period leading up to Christmas, certain feast days dedicated to saints, specific days of the week. These all carried the potential for abstinence. Now, whether everyone actually followed these rules to the letter is another question. We're talking about human nature here, folks. But the idea was there, and for many adherents was a matter of genuine faith and social pressure. Your local priest wasn't exactly shy about reminding people of their obligations, and the fear of divine retribution, well, that was a powerful motivator. But it wasn't just about religious rules. Social customs played a role too. Think about the agricultural cycle. During harvest season, for example, everyone, and I mean everyone, was working practically around the clock. Days were long, energy was scarce, and the focus was entirely on getting the crops in before the weather turned. Let's just say that romantic interludes were probably pretty low on the priority list. Exhaustion can be a pretty effective contraceptive, right? Then there were periods of travel. Medieval life wasn't all cozy villages and predictable routines. Pilgrimages were common, and often involved long journeys on foot or by boat. If a husband was away on pilgrimage for months or even years, well, that's a pretty straightforward method of abstinence. And let's not forget the constant threat of warfare. Men frequently went off to fight, sometimes for extended periods, leaving their wives behind. Again, not exactly conducive to baby making. Now, the million-dollar question: how effective was this periodic abstinence? Honestly, it's impossible to say for sure. We don't have medieval fertility statistics broken down by religious observance or harvest cycles. What we do know is that medieval birth rates were, on average, lower than what we might expect, given the lack of reliable contraception and the economic incentive to have children. This suggests that abstinence, both intentional and unintentional, did have an impact. Think about it. If a couple abstained for, say, a third of the year due to religious holidays, seasonal work, or travel, that significantly reduces their chances of conception. Add in the other factors we've already discussed: women's knowledge of herbal remedies, coitus interruptus, breastfeeding, and you start to get a picture of a society where pregnancy was, to some extent, managed, even if not always perfectly or consciously. Of course, prolonged abstinence also had its downsides. For some couples, it may have been a source of frustration or marital tension. The church, despite its emphasis on abstinence, also stressed the importance of marital relations for maintaining social order and preventing unnatural desires. So couples were caught between conflicting expectations. Furthermore, the effectiveness of abstinence depended heavily on individual compliance. Not everyone was devout, and not everyone prioritized religious obligations over their personal desires. So while abstinence was a significant factor in medieval fertility control, it was by no means a foolproof solution. It was just one piece of a complex puzzle, a thread in the tapestry of medieval life, and one that shows that controlling fertility was not just an individual choice, but something influenced by the rhythms of religion, society, and the land itself. Sweet dreams. Alright, so let's gently drift into the topic of marriage age and celibacy in the medieval period. It's kind of like wading into a warm bath, just easing ourselves into it. Now, when we think about medieval medieval times, we might picture everyone getting hitched super young, like Romeo and Juliet young. And while early marriages definitely happened, especially among the nobility for political and economic reasons, it wasn't always the norm, especially for the average person. The church, which had a pretty big say in things back then, technically considered girls marriageable at 12 and boys at 14. That was the absolute minimum legal age. But canon law, that wasn't necessarily what actually happened on the ground. It's like the speed limit on the highway. You can go that fast, but should you? Probably not. For one thing, practical concerns played a huge role. Peasant families, for example, usually needed their children's labor. Marrying off a daughter too early meant losing a valuable pair of hands in the fields or the household. So even if a girl was technically old enough to marry, her family might delay it until she was older and stronger, able to handle the physical demands of marriage, childbirth, and well, just life in general. Think about it. Plowing fields, hauling water, cooking over an open fire. It wasn't exactly a walk in the park. You needed some serious stamina. So waiting until a young woman was, say, in her late teens or early 20s, was often the more sensible option. It made sure she could survive and contribute to the household. It really depended on how big the house was, the size of the family, and the overall economic situation. It's like choosing a good ripe fruit for your market stand, and not the first one to fall off the tree. And then there's the whole inheritance thing. Families often wanted to ensure they had heirs before dividing up their land or property. So waiting until they were secure that the couple could actually produce children, or at least that the young woman had fully developed physically, was a consideration. Nobody wants to lose the farm, because the young couple is simply not able to carry on the family name. Now let's switch gears and talk about celibacy. It wasn't just for priests and nuns, you know. While the church obviously promoted celibacy for its clergy as a way to dedicate themselves fully to God, it also influenced attitudes towards marriage and sex in general. There was this idea that while marriage was a good and holy thing, it was also less holy than remaining celibate. Celibacy was seen as a higher calling, a way to transcend earthly desires and get closer to the divine. It's like choosing a quiet retreat over a bustling marketplace. Because of this ideal, some people chose to remain unmarried and celibate, even if they weren't entering a religious order. Maybe they felt a stronger connection to God that way, or maybe they just didn't want the responsibilities of marriage and family. And it wasn't just individuals making this choice. Sometimes families would encourage one of their children, especially a daughter, to remain unmarried to avoid dividing up the family inheritance. It's like keeping all your eggs in one basket to make sure they all hatch. This was especially common in noble families where keeping land and titles intact was super important. The son gets married and keeps the titles, the daughter remains unmarried and joins a convent or simply takes vows of celibacy and remains within the family. Then there were widows and widowers. While remarriage was common, some chose to remain single after losing their spouse. Maybe they didn't want to go through the pain of loss again, or maybe they felt it was disrespectful to their deceased partner. This was especially the case if they were older and already had children. It's like tending a garden that's already blooming, rather than starting a new one from scratch. Beyond personal choices, there were also social and economic factors that could lead to involuntary celibacy. For example, sometimes women became members of Beguine communities. These were religious communities, popular especially in parts of Northern Europe. Here the ladies committed to living in poverty and dedicating their lives to good works, caring for the sick, for instance, but they did so without taking permanent vows of celibacy, and they could leave the community at any time if they so chose. And what if you were super poor? Well, for some people, marriage was simply unaffordable. You needed resources to start a household, and if you didn't have them, you might just have to stay single. It's like wanting to build a house but not having the tools or the land. Also, something that is easy to forget about, medieval times were full of war and disease. These catastrophes meant a huge number of women were left as widows, and the population could suffer severe reductions. If there were fewer men, some women were simply simply unable to marry. So marriage age and celibacy in the medieval period were much more nuanced than we often think. It wasn't all about child brides and forced marriages. Practical concerns, religious beliefs, economic realities, and personal choices all played a role in shaping people's decisions about when, or even if, to tie the knot. It's like a complex tapestry woven with threads of tradition, necessity, and individual agency. And like any good tapestry, it's worth taking a closer look to appreciate all the intricate details. Alright, that's that then. Time for a bit of a nap before we move on to even more interesting topics.
Zizzes.
Alright, settle in, because we're about to dive into some seriously, well, let's call them interesting methods of fertility control. We're talking superstitions and amulets, the medieval equivalent of trusting your life to a chain email promising good luck. This is where medicine and magic got real cozy. Now, the medieval mindset was, shall we say, ripe for superstition. Scientific understanding of reproduction was lacking. So people filled the void with what they thought they knew, often blending religious beliefs with folklore and good old-fashioned wishful thinking. In this section, we will specifically stick to all things magical and beliefs of the world. Think about it. Conception, gestation, childbirth. These were all pretty mysterious processes. No one really understood the intricate dance of hormones and eggs and sperm. What they did see were patterns, coincidences, and outcomes that confirmed their pre-existing beliefs. A woman drinks a special tea and doesn't get pregnant. The tea worked. Never mind that she might have been infertile, or the timing was off, or a dozen other factors. Magic. Amulets were a huge part of this. These weren't just pretty necklaces or bracelets, they were objects imbued with power, designed to either ward off conception or sometimes, paradoxically, promote fertility depending on the need. One popular belief revolved around stones, specific stones believed to hold magical properties. For example, jet, a type of black gemstone, was often used to protect against various ailments, including unwanted pregnancy. Women might wear jet necklaces or carry jet stones in pouches, believing they could block conception. Other materials found their way into amulets too. Herbs, obviously, but also animal parts. A rabbit's foot for good luck. Medieval folks thought even more specialized parts could ward off pregnancies. We're talking dried organs, bones, and even teeth. Charming, right? Now, I don't have the stomach to get too specific here, but you get the picture. The choice of animal part often depended on the perceived characteristics of the animal. For example, a barren animal's remains might be used to induce infertility, while, oddly enough, sometimes they would believe it would prevent infertility. Logic wasn't always a strong point in the Middle Ages. The effectiveness of these amulets, of course, was entirely psychological, but the placebo effect is a powerful thing. If a woman believed an amulet would protect her, it might reduce her anxiety, which could in turn have a small effect on her menstrual cycle or libido. But amulets were just the tip of the iceberg. Superstitions permeated every aspect of medieval life, and sex was no exception. Certain days were considered unlucky for conceiving. Religious holidays, for example, were often deemed inappropriate for marital relations. Some days of the week were thought to be more fertile than others, though opinions varied wildly on which days were lucky. Position during intercourse was another source of superstition. Certain positions were believed to be more likely to result in conception than others. Again, there was no real scientific basis for this, but the belief persisted. Some positions were seen as closing the womb, while others were believed to open it and increase the chances of pregnancy. There's even some documentation that they would be wary of letting the women enjoy their orgasm to prevent likelihood of conception. And then there were rituals, elaborate, often bizarre rituals designed to influence fertility. Some involved burying objects in the ground, reciting specific prayers or incantations, or even consuming strange concoctions. A woman might bury a piece of parchment inscribed with a specific prayer, believing it would create a protective barrier against conception. Or she might drink a potion made from herbs and animal parts, again, I apologize for the imagery, hoping it would disrupt the natural processes of reproduction. Dreams, too, played a role. Certain dreams were interpreted as omens of fertility or infertility. A dream about fruit, for example, might be seen as a sign of impending pregnancy, while a dream about barren land might suggest the opposite. Think of them as medieval pregnancy tests that were probably wrong. The power of the stars was also taken very seriously. Astrology was a major part of medieval life, and people believed that the positions of the planets and stars at the time of conception could influence the outcome of the pregnancy. Certain astrological signs were considered more favorable for conception than others, and couples might try to time their intimate encounters accordingly. This led to some serious scheduling. It's easy to dismiss all of this as nonsense, but it's important to remember that these beliefs provided people with a sense of control in a world where they had very little. Pregnancy was a risky business, and the fear of unwanted children was a real concern. Superstitions and amulets offered a way to manage that fear, to feel like they were doing something to influence their own destinies, and that in itself is pretty powerful. It highlights the human need to understand the world around us and to exert some control over our lives, even when faced with the unknown. In that sense, these medieval superstitions and amulets aren't so different from some of the beliefs we hold today. We all have our rituals, our lucky charms, our ways of coping with uncertainty. The specifics might be different, but the underlying human impulse is the same. So next time you knock on wood, remember those medieval folks clutching their jetstones. We're all just trying to make sense of the magic, aren't we? Alright, let's cozy up to the somewhat awkward topic of the fellas, specifically their alleged role in medieval family planning, or more accurately, their often distinct lack of a role. Now I know what you're thinking, isn't reproduction a team effort? Well, in theory, yes, but the medieval world, particularly when it came to matters of the bedroom and babies, was, let's just say, unfairly distributed. For the most part, men in medieval times weren't exactly leading the charge in figuring out how to avoid having children. Shocking, I know. Now this isn't to say that every single medieval dude was completely clueless or uncaring, but the prevailing attitudes and social structures definitely put the onus, that's the burden, for any Latin sticklers out there, squarely on the women. Think about it. Who bore the children? The women. Who faced the often fatal risks of childbirth? The women. Who was primarily responsible for raising and caring for those children? You guessed it, the women. So naturally, the responsibility for limiting the number of children often fell to them as well. The church, of course, had strong opinions on this, and as we discussed earlier, those opinions were complicated. The ideal was procreation within marriage, a sacrament ordained by God, but at the same time they preached about lust and the dangers of excessive carnal desire, and, well, they weren't exactly handing out condoms at confession. Their solutions were basically abstinence. So where did this leave the medieval man, often blissfully unaware, or at least conveniently detached, from the realities of family planning? There's a distinct silence in the historical record when it comes to male perspectives on contraception. We have tons of surviving medical texts, herbals, and even personal letters that reveal what women knew and did, but male voices, much quieter. This silence could mean a few things. Maybe men genuinely didn't know about the methods women were using. Maybe they knew but didn't want to acknowledge it, preferring to maintain a plausible deniability. Or perhaps, and this is the most cynical option, maybe they simply didn't care. As long as their needs were met and heirs were produced, the specifics of how many children were born and the toll it took on their wives were secondary. Now, I don't want to paint everyone with the same brush. there were undoubtedly men who were concerned about their wives' health and well-being, and who perhaps even actively participated in limiting family size. Maybe they practiced coitus interruptus, that's withdrawal before, well, you know. It wasn't exactly reliable, but it was something a man could actively do. Then again, that method was pretty dependent on a man's self-control. And let's just say, a lot of medieval sermons suggest that self-control wasn't exactly a widespread virtue. There's also the possibility that some men exerted control through other means. For example, dictating the frequency of intercourse based on religious observances or personal preferences. Prolonged abstinence, as we'll discuss later, was sometimes practiced for spiritual reasons, or even for social reasons. Think traveling merchants away from home for long periods. And let's not forget the influence of social class. Among the peasantry, where children were often seen as extra hands to help with farm work, there might have been less pressure to limit family size, whereas among the nobility, concerns about inheritance and maintaining family wealth might have led some men to be more proactive in limiting the number of legitimate heirs. Bastards were never the problem, but still, the overarching picture is one of male disengagement. The risks and responsibilities of pregnancy and childbirth were primarily borne by women, and sadly, many men seemed content to leave it that way. It makes you think, doesn't it, about the power dynamics at play, the societal expectations, and the sheer vulnerability of women in a world where their reproductive capacity was both their greatest asset and their greatest burden. So while the historical record might be a bit muted on the direct role of medieval men in pregnancy avoidance, their indirect role through societal influence and general apathy is definitely something we need to consider. It's a slightly depressing reality check, but an important one for understanding the full picture of medieval family life. We're going to have to shift gears and discuss if there were any herbal remedies men used to reduce their libido in the next segment. Alright, settle in folks, because we're diving into a somewhat speculative corner of medieval life. We've talked a lot about the ladies and their herbal concoctions, but what about the fellas? Did they just stand idly by while their wives brewed up potentially dangerous potions? Well, not exactly. There's evidence, albeit a bit murkier, suggesting that men too explored ways to influence their fertility, or, more accurately, their supposed sterility, or even their libido, through, you guessed it, herbs. Now, let's be super clear. Unlike the somewhat better documented, though still often shrouded in secrecy knowledge surrounding women's herbal remedies, information on male-focused sterility or libido reduction is much harder to come by. Why? Several reasons. Firstly, medieval society, as we touched on earlier, placed a huge emphasis on male virility and the ability to produce heirs. A man admitting, or even exploring, methods to reduce his fertility could be seen as, well, less than manly. It challenged his role, his status, his very identity in a patriarchal world. This, understandably, led to a reluctance to document, or even discuss, such practices openly. Secondly, a lot of the medical and herbal knowledge was passed down through women. While male physicians existed, the day-to-day healthcare, especially concerning reproduction, was often handled by women within the family and community. So, the recipes and knowledge were often kept within those female circles. So what do we know? Well, we have scattered references in medical texts, folklore, and anecdotal evidence that hint at certain plants and substances believed to affect male fertility and libido. But, and this is a big but, it's absolutely crucial to remember that these remedies were based on the limited scientific understanding of the time. We're talking about a world without microscopes, without any real understanding of hormones or the reproductive system. So, these claims should be viewed with a huge grain of salt, and absolutely not tried at home. Seriously, don't go chewing on random medieval herbs based on this video. I am not a doctor, and neither were those guys back then. Okay, disclaimer aside, let's peek at some of these purported male remedies. One that pops up occasionally is rue. Now, rue was a pretty common herb in medieval gardens, used for all sorts of things, from flavoring food to warding off evil spirits. But some sources suggest that rue, when consumed in large quantities, could potentially reduce libido. The mechanism, no one really knew. Maybe it just tasted so awful it killed the mood, who knows. The general idea was that rue had a cooling effect on the body, which was believed to dampen sexual desire. Again, zero scientific backing, but that was the theory. Another recurring herb is lettuce. Yes, lettuce. You know, the leafy green in your salad. Medieval people thought it was a real buzzkill. They, just like, had it all wrong. But in the medieval mindset, lettuce was considered extremely cooling and moist, the complete opposite of fiery passion. So, excessive lettuce consumption was believed to reduce sperm production and diminish sexual desire. Basically, the medieval equivalent of saying Netflix and lettuce was a guarantee of zero action. Then there's hemlock. Now, hemlock is not something you want to mess with. It's incredibly poisonous, famously used to execute Socrates. However, some historical texts suggest that, in extremely small doses, it was sometimes used to reduce sexual urges. The logic was basically, this stuff is so deadly, it'll shut down everything, including your libido. Obviously, this was incredibly dangerous, and probably did more harm than good. It's also possible that the desired effect wasn't actually a reduction in libido, but rather a general feeling of being unwell, which, unsurprisingly, doesn't exactly get you in the mood. I would really hope no one actually experimented with this. Beyond specific herbs, some texts mention dietary approaches. For example, eating lots of vinegar was thought to cool the humors and reduce sexual desire. Similarly, excessive consumption of watery foods, like melons or cucumbers, was also believed to have a similar effect. The underlying principle was all about balancing the body's humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An excess of heat and dryness was thought to stimulate sexual desire, while an excess of coolness and moisture was thought to suppress it. It's also worth noting that some of these remedies weren't necessarily about reducing fertility, but rather about addressing perceived infertility. In a society that often blamed women for a couple's failure to conceive, men sometimes sought remedies to boost their virility and sperm production. For example, some texts recommend eating specific types of meat, like testicles, or consuming honey and spices, believed to be warming and stimulating. The problem is, even these male fertility boosters were often based on flawed understanding. They might have improved overall health and energy levels, but they likely had little to no direct impact on sperm production or fertility. Moreover, many of the recommendations were simply based on sympathetic magic, the idea that like attracts like. So eating testicles was thought to boost virility, because, well, testicles are associated with virility. Now, let's be realistic about how widespread these practices were. It's hard to say for sure. Given the social stigma surrounding male infertility and the lack of reliable information, it's likely that only a small percentage of men actively sought out or used these remedies, and those that did probably kept it very quiet. I would also imagine it was more common amongst scholars and the wealthy, considering a lot of the ingredients had to be imported. It's also important to consider the placebo effect. In a world without scientific medicine, belief and expectation played a huge role. If a man believed that rue would reduce his libido, it might actually have done so, simply through the power of suggestion. Furthermore, we can't rule out that some of these male methods to regulate fertility were just superstitious rituals with little to no active ingredient. Ultimately, the story of male herbal remedies in the Middle Ages is one of limited knowledge, social pressures, and a lot of guesswork. While women played a more central role in regulating fertility, men were not entirely absent from the conversation. They too explored ways to influence their reproductive capacity, or at least their perceived reproductive capacity, using the tools and understanding available to them. So, next time you're munching on a salad, remember that medieval people thought you were actively trying to kill the mood, and maybe, just maybe, be grateful that we live in a world with slightly better scientific understanding of the human body, and less pressure to conform to outdated gender roles. But as with everything medieval, there are some lessons of caution that could be taken when looking at more modern science. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm off to make some herbal tea, definitely not rue. Sweet dreams, everyone. Alright, so let's settle in and talk about something you might not immediately associate with medieval pregnancy prevention, diet and nutrition. I know, sounds boring, right? But trust me, food availability, or the lack thereof, played a surprisingly big role in fertility during this era. We're not just talking about basic sustenance here, we're talking about how the very availability of calories, vitamins and minerals could directly influence a couple's chances of conceiving. So, find that comfy spot, take a deep breath, and let's dive into the surprisingly fascinating world of medieval meals and their impact on baby making. First off, let's paint a picture of the average medieval person's diet. For the vast majority, particularly those in the peasant class, life was a constant struggle for enough to eat. Forget those images of overflowing tables laden with roasted meats. That was largely a privilege of the nobility. Most people were scraping by on a diet that was heavily reliant on grains. Think barley, oats, rye, the kinds of crops that could survive in the often harsh conditions of the medieval countryside. Bread was a staple, often coarse and dark, and formed the basis of most meals. Now, why does this matter for fertility? Well, consistent malnourishment, which was a very real problem for many, can directly impact a woman's ability to conceive. A body that's constantly fighting to stay alive simply isn't going to prioritize reproduction. It's a biological imperative: survival first, babies later. Think of it like this: if your body is operating on fumes, it's not going to have the resources to support a pregnancy. And it wasn't just about overall calorie intake. Specific nutrient deficiencies could also play a role. Iron, for example, is crucial for healthy ovulation. A diet lacking in iron, common in populations where meat consumption was infrequent, could lead to irregular cycles or even a complete cessation of menstruation, a condition known as amenorrhea. But it wasn't just the women who were affected. Men's fertility could also suffer from poor nutrition. Adequate zinc intake, for example, is essential for sperm production and motility. A diet low in zinc, again common in populations where meat was a luxury, could lead to lower sperm counts and decreased fertility. Now, let's consider the seasons. Medieval life was intimately tied to the agricultural cycle. Spring and summer brought a relative abundance of fresh fruits and vegetables, supplementing the grain-heavy diet. This meant a greater intake of vitamins and minerals, potentially boosting fertility during these times. Think of it as nature's subtle way of encouraging procreation during the warmer months, when resources were more plentiful. But then came autumn and winter. Food stores dwindled, and the diet became even more monotonous and nutrient-poor. This period of scarcity, often referred to as the hungry gap, could have a significant impact on fertility. Women might experience a temporary suppression of ovulation, and men's sperm quality could decline. So theoretically, the couples were probably less likely to conceive during these leaner months. Of course, there were regional variations as well. Coastal communities had access to fish and seafood, providing a valuable source of protein and essential fatty acids. These nutrients would have likely contributed to better overall health and potentially improved fertility compared to inland populations relying solely on grains. And what about the nobility? Well, their access to a more varied and abundant diet likely meant they faced fewer nutritional limitations on fertility. They could afford to eat meat more regularly, ensuring adequate protein and iron intake. They also had access to a wider range of fruits, vegetables, and spices, providing a broader spectrum of vitamins and minerals. This could explain, in part, why noble families often seem to have larger numbers of children compared to their peasant counterparts. Of course, other factors like access to better healthcare and living conditions also played a role. Now, it's important to remember that the medievals themselves didn't have a sophisticated understanding of nutrition. They didn't know about vitamins, minerals, or the role of specific nutrients in reproduction. However, they did observe correlations between food availability and fertility. For example, periods of famine were often followed by declines in birth rates, a connection they likely understood on a practical, if not scientific, level. So what's the takeaway here? The medieval diet, particularly for the peasant class, was often characterized by scarcity and nutritional deficiencies. This could have a direct impact on fertility, affecting both men and women, while the nobility enjoyed a more abundant and varied diet, likely leading to improved fertility. The vast majority of the population faced significant nutritional limitations, and while medieval people didn't fully understand the science behind it, they did observe the connection between food availability and the ability to conceive. Pretty interesting, huh? It just goes to show how something as seemingly basic as food can have a profound impact on something as fundamental as reproduction. Next up, we will be talking about disease, so stick around. Alright, settle in folks. Let's talk about something a little grim, but absolutely vital to understanding birth rates in the medieval period: disease, plagues, and famine. Yeah, not exactly bedtime story material, I know, but trust me, it's fascinating in a morbid kind of way. So forget romantic notions of knights and castles for a minute, and picture this: you're living in a village, maybe a small town. Life is already hard, backbreaking labor, limited food, and then sickness starts spreading. Not just a bad cold, but something terrifying. Something that leaves people with buboes the size of apples, or coughing up blood, or just wasting away. We're talking about plagues, of course, most famously the Black Death. But it wasn't the only plague. There were waves of bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, septicemic plague, each with its own horrifying symptoms and mortality rate. These weren't isolated incidents either. Plagues would sweep across continents, sometimes multiple times in a single generation. You can only imagine the trauma it caused. Now, how did all this affect birth rates? Well, pretty directly, honestly. Obviously, if a large chunk of the population dies, you're going to have fewer people to make babies. Obvious, right? But it's more nuanced than that. The Black Death, for example, wiped out somewhere between 30% and 60% of Europe's population. That's a staggering loss. It decimated families, disrupted communities, and created a climate of fear and uncertainty. Even if you survived, would you really be thinking about bringing another child into such a dangerous world? Maybe, maybe not. Beyond the immediate mortality, plagues also had longer-term effects on fertility. Think about it. Widespread disease puts a huge strain on the body. Surviving an infection like the plague takes a lot of energy and resources. For women, in particular, this could disrupt their menstrual cycles, making it harder to conceive. Plus, the stress of living through a plague would have had a psychological impact, potentially decreasing libido and further reducing the chances of pregnancy. But it wasn't just plagues, either. Famine was a recurring nightmare in medieval Europe. Crop failures were common, whether due to bad weather, pests, or just poor agricultural practices. And when the food supply dwindled, everyone suffered. Famine had a particularly devastating impact on pregnant women and young children. Malnutrition during pregnancy increases the risk of miscarriage, stillbirth, and birth defects. And even if a child survived birth, they were more likely to die in infancy or early childhood if they weren't getting enough to eat. So even if couples wanted to have children, famine often made it impossible. Beyond immediate risks, famine also disrupted women's cycles. If you are very underweight, your body thinks you are in a survival situation. Periods get missed or stopped altogether. This is a natural thing, and it happens now too. If a woman doesn't have enough body fat, her body is basically saying, hey, now is not the time to start growing a whole human. It simply doesn't have the energy to handle pregnancy and labor and breastfeeding, and the whole thing would be too dangerous. Okay, so plagues and famine, clearly terrible for everyone. But did they affect all social classes equally? Unlikely, right? Of course, it was worse if you were poor. Disease and starvation tend to hit the poor harder than the wealthy. The upper classes generally had access to better food, cleaner water, and more sanitary living conditions, which gave them a bit of an edge when it came to surviving plagues and famines. They also had doctors, as ineffective as they might have been. Peasants, on the other hand, often lived in cramped, crowded conditions, with limited access to clean water and sanitation. They were also more likely to be malnourished, making them more susceptible to disease. So, when a plague or famine struck, they were disproportionately affected. However, it's not quite as simple as rich people survived, poor people died. Even the wealthy weren't immune to these disasters. Plagues, in particular, could spread rapidly through all levels of society. And even the best-stocked granaries could eventually run empty during a prolonged famine. So everyone felt the impact, but the poor definitely felt it more acutely. Another interesting thing to consider is how these events might have affected marriage patterns. After a major plague, there were often labor shortages, as a lot of the workforce literally disappeared. This could lead to increased wages for those who survived, and maybe even opportunities for social mobility. It could also lead to people marrying younger or remarrying more quickly after losing a spouse. Basically, people trying to get back to some kind of normal and rebuild their lives. And it's worth mentioning one tiny, possibly very controversial theory. In the aftermath of the Black Death, some historians believe that the survivors had improved diets. More meat was available, more food was spare. This could have led to earlier periods in women and better fertility. Some historians think this is the reason that the population bounced back so fast. Controversial, but worth keeping in mind. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Some historians argue that plagues and famines, despite their devastating effects, could also lead to a long-term increase in living standards for those who survived. It's grim, but the fact remains that when the population is reduced, there is more space for the survivors, and more food to go around. Think about it. Fewer people competing for the same resources means higher wages, lower rents, and more opportunities. This could in turn lead to better nutrition, improved health, and ultimately higher birth rates in the generations that followed. It's a bleak silver lining, but it's a factor worth considering. So where are we? Plagues and famines were a constant threat in medieval Europe, and they had a profound impact on birth rates. They caused widespread death, disrupted fertility, and created a climate of fear and uncertainty. While they disproportionately affected the poor, no one was completely immune. But in a strange twist of fate, these disasters may have also led to some long-term improvements in living standards for those who managed to survive. It's a complicated and often depressing picture, but it's essential for understanding the realities of life in the medieval period, and the challenges that people faced when it came to starting and raising families. Okay, let's move on to something a little lighter, shall we? Alright, so now we got to talk about how all this stuff, all these methods we've been going over, changed depending on whether you were a peasant or a noble. I mean, it makes sense, right? Everything was different for those two groups, so of course their reproductive habits would be too. Let's dive in, nice and slow. For the peasants, the reality was, well, pretty grim, TBH. Life was hard. Really hard. You were basically at the mercy of the land, the weather, the local lord, the church. Everybody, basically, except yourself. And that affected everything, you know. One big difference was access, or rather the lack of access, to anything resembling reliable information or resources. Forget about fancy herbal remedies or imported sponges. Peasants relied almost entirely on what they learned from their mothers, grandmothers, and other women in their villages. It was all oral tradition, passed down through generations. Superstitions were definitely mixed in too, but honestly, what choice did they have, you know? Their methods were, let's say, rustic. Coitus interruptus was probably the most common, simply because it didn't require anything special, just, control. Which, let's be honest, probably wasn't super reliable when you're exhausted after a 16-hour day in the fields and maybe had a little too much ale at dinner. Herbal remedies were a big part of it too, but it was a crapshoot, honestly. They used plants like pennyroyal, rue and savin, which were thought to be abortifacients, basically plants that could cause a miscarriage. But the problem was, these herbs are toxic, like, really toxic. So you're basically playing Russian roulette with your health, hoping to end a pregnancy without, dying. Not a great option, to say the least. Another thing to consider is the economic reality. Peasant families needed children, like, desperately. Kids weren't just cute little bundles of joy, though I'm sure some were, lol, they were labor. From like age 5, they'd be helping out in the fields, tending animals, fetching water, basically anything to contribute to the family's survival. So while they might have wanted to space out pregnancies, completely avoiding them probably wasn't the goal most of the time. They needed those extra hands. It's just the brutal truth of it all. Then there's the whole issue of male dominance. Peasant women had very little say in their reproductive lives. If their husbands wanted children, they usually got them. There wasn't exactly a lot of room for negotiation, And honestly, information that was passed down generationally was often spotty or simply incorrect. It really was a case of the blind leading the blind, in many ways. Now, let's flip the script and talk about the nobles. Oh, the nobility. What a different world. These were the folks living in castles, wearing fancy clothes, and basically, ruling the roost. And their approach to pregnancy was unsurprisingly a whole lot different. For starters, they had access. Access to information, access to resources, access to doctors. Yeah, those fancy physicians we talked about. They were mostly catering to the wealthy elite, dispensing advice, some of it accurate, some of it not so much, and prescribing remedies that were completely out of reach for the average peasant. Nobles could afford imported sponges, which they'd soak in vinegar or other acidic substances and use as pessaries, basically a barrier to prevent sperm from entering the uterus. It probably wasn't super effective, but it was definitely a step up from nothing. They also had access to more sophisticated herbal remedies. They could afford to buy them from apothecaries who, hopefully knew what they were doing, though again, no guarantees. Plus, noble women often had more control over their diets, which could affect their fertility. A well-nourished body is generally more fertile than a malnourished one, so that played a role too. But, and this is a big but, noble families also had different priorities when it came to children. While peasant families needed more children for labor, noble families were often more concerned with quality over quantity. They needed heirs to inherit their titles and estates, but too many children could create problems with inheritance, divide the family wealth, and lead to squabbles over power. So controlling family size was often a strategic decision, not just a personal one. Also, noble women often had more social power than peasant women. They might have been able to negotiate with their husbands about family size, or even outright refuse to have more children. Of course, this depended on the specific couple and the social context, but generally speaking, noble women had more agency over their reproductive lives. Wet nursing was also a big thing among the nobles. It allowed them to, in theory, space out pregnancies and avoid lactational amenorrhea. Lactational amenorrhea, remember, is when a woman doesn't ovulate while breastfeeding, nature's contraceptive, if you will. But if you pawn the baby off on someone else, then wham, it is back to baby making. And let's not forget the social pressures. Noble marriages were often about alliances and consolidating power, not necessarily about love. So, if a noble woman failed to produce an heir, she could be replaced, divorced, or even banished. The stakes were high. So basically, when it comes to peasants and nobles, it's a tale of two worlds. Peasants were struggling to survive, often needing more children for labor and having limited access to any kind of reliable contraception. Nobles, on the other hand, had more resources, more control, and different priorities when it came to family size. It just highlights how incredibly unequal medieval society was, even when it came to something as personal as having children. And it makes you think, doesn't it? Alright, let's get into one of the more sobering aspects of the medieval experience: pregnancy and childbirth. It's easy to romanticize the past, to picture idyllic scenes of happy families, but the reality was often starkly different. For medieval women, pregnancy wasn't just a natural part of life. It was a roll of the dice, a gamble with incredibly high stakes, and those stakes, well, they were life and death. We're talking about truly shocking mortality rates, folks. Estimates vary depending on the region, time period, and social class, but we're generally looking at maternal mortality rates that would absolutely floor us today. Imagine a woman facing somewhere between a 1 in 10 and a 1 in 5 chance of dying during childbirth, or in the immediate weeks following. Let that sink in. Every time a woman got pregnant, it was like walking a tightrope over a chasm. Why were things so dire? Well, for starters, let's just say medieval medicine wasn't exactly cutting edge, pun intended. They lacked the basic understanding of hygiene and infection control that we take for granted. Germ theory? Non-existent. Antiseptics? Nope. Even hand washing, something so simple, was not a widespread practice among even skilled practitioners. So you've got childbirth often happening in unsanitary conditions, attended by midwives who, bless their hearts, were often relying on a combination of traditional knowledge, superstition, and whatever seemed to work in the past, and very little scientific backing. Then you have to factor in the nutritional deficiencies that were rampant, especially among the peasantry. A woman's body needs a huge boost in nutrients during pregnancy. But if you're living on a diet of mostly grains, maybe a bit of seasonal vegetables, and the occasional bit of salted meat if you're lucky, well, that baby is pulling nutrients out of a severely depleted source. This leads to weakened immune systems for both mom and baby, increasing susceptibility to infections and complications. And those complications, they could be devastating. We're talking about things like postpartum hemorrhage, excessive bleeding after birth, which was a major killer. Without blood transfusions or even a real understanding of how to stop the bleeding effectively, a woman could literally bleed to death within hours. Then there's puerperal fever, also known as childbed fever, which was a bacterial infection of the uterus after childbirth. This was another huge killer, and it was often spread by, you guessed it, unwashed hands. The symptoms, fever, abdominal pain, foul-smelling discharge, were terrifying, and the treatment options were, well, let's just say they weren't very effective. Obstructed labor was another nightmare. Imagine a baby too large to pass through the birth canal, or positioned in a way that made delivery impossible. Today, a C-section would solve that in minutes. Back then, it could mean days of agonizing labor, leading to exhaustion, infection, and ultimately, death for both mother and baby. Forceps existed, but their use was risky and often caused more harm than good. And it wasn't just childbirth itself that was dangerous. Pregnancy also put a tremendous strain on a woman's body, making her more vulnerable to other illnesses. Anemia was common, weakening her resistance to infections. Pre-existing conditions like heart problems or tuberculosis could be exacerbated by the pregnancy, turning a manageable illness into a life-threatening one. Keep in mind too, the physical demands placed on medieval women, especially peasant women. They were working hard, often right up until the moment they went into labor. Think about it: farming, carrying heavy loads, tending to animals, preparing food, all while heavily pregnant. That kind of physical exertion, coupled with poor nutrition, puts an incredible strain on the body, making pregnancy far more dangerous. Moreover, there's a sad reality to consider: women's health simply wasn't prioritized. Medical texts, primarily written by men, often viewed women's bodies as, well, a bit of a mystery. There was a fundamental lack of understanding of female anatomy and physiology, and this ignorance translated into ineffective and sometimes harmful treatments. Women's health concerns were often dismissed or attributed to hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for anything that baffled male physicians. Now it's important to remember that not all women experienced the same level of risk. Noble women, for example, generally had better access to food, cleaner living conditions, and sometimes even more skilled medical care. But even for them, pregnancy was still a significant threat. Wealth couldn't completely shield them from the dangers of infection or complications. So when we talk about medieval couples trying to avoid pregnancy, it's important to understand the context. It wasn't just about avoiding unwanted children, although that certainly played a role. It was also about survival. It was about women trying to protect their own bodies, their own lives, in a world where pregnancy was often a death sentence. It was about families desperately trying to avoid the heartbreak of losing a mother, a wife, a daughter. Alright, let's talk about the really difficult stuff now. The stuff nobody really wants to think about when we're picturing cozy medieval villages and knights in shining armor. We're heading into a dark corner of history, one where desperate measures were taken when all other options seemed to have failed. I'm talking about infanticide and child abandonment. Now, I want to preface this by saying that this is a deeply sensitive topic. It's easy to judge people from centuries ago by modern standards, but we have to remember the incredibly harsh realities of medieval life. Imagine being a peasant woman, already struggling to feed yourself, your husband, and maybe several other children. Another pregnancy could mean starvation, death during childbirth, which was super common, or simply not being able to provide for the child adequately. It's a bleak picture. So infanticide, the killing of an infant, existed. There's no getting around it. It was without a doubt a crime born of sheer desperation, and it wasn't unique to the medieval period, by any means. We see evidence of it in many cultures throughout history, when resources are scarce and societal pressures are immense. While the sources are understandably murky, people weren't exactly advertising this after all. Historians have pieced together evidence from court records, church documents, and archaeological finds that paint a grim picture. Often the victims were illegitimate children, born outside of marriage. A woman in that situation faced enormous social stigma, potential ostracization from her community, and the very real risk of being unable to support the child on her own. The methods used were, well, they're hard to talk about. Suffocation, exposure, and drowning were all tragically common. Sometimes these acts were carried out shortly after birth, making it difficult to even prove a crime had occurred. Imagine the mental state of someone driven to that point. The crushing weight of poverty, the fear of societal judgment, the sheer terror of not being able to provide. But here's a crucial point. Infanticide wasn't always viewed in the same way by everyone. The church, of course, condemned it outright as murder, a violation of God's law. But societal attitudes were more complex. In some communities, particularly in times of extreme famine or hardship, there might have been a sort of reluctant acceptance, a grim understanding that it was a horrific choice made under unimaginable pressure. Not condoned, certainly, but perhaps understood on some level. Now, abandonment. This was, in many ways, a slightly less drastic, albeit still heartbreaking, option. Rather than actively ending a child's life, some parents chose to leave them, often in public places like church steps, hoping someone else would take them in and care for them. Think about the sheer gamble involved. You're leaving your child, completely vulnerable, to the mercy of strangers. There was no guarantee they'd be found, no guarantee they'd be taken in by a kind person. They could easily succumb to exposure, starvation, or disease. But for some parents, it was a better alternative than actively taking a life. Again, illegitimacy played a huge role. Foundling homes, orphanages established to care for abandoned children, started to appear during the medieval period, often run by religious orders. These institutions provided a refuge for some, but they were often overcrowded, underfunded, and plagued by high mortality rates. Life in a foundling home was rarely easy. Children were often given simple names, like Innocent or Deo Gratias, Tio Thanks Be to God, reflecting their unknown origins. They received basic care, but emotional warmth was often lacking. They were raised to be laborers, learning trades or skills that would allow them to contribute to society. The motivations behind abandonment were complex. Sometimes it was poverty, pure and simple. Other times it was the shame of illegitimacy, the fear of social ostracization, and sometimes it was a combination of factors, a perfect storm of desperation. It's really important to remember that these weren't callous acts. They were born of profound despair. These parents, often young women, were trapped in circumstances beyond their control, forced to make impossible choices. We can't sugarcoat it. Infanticide and child abandonment were tragic realities of medieval life. They were symptoms of a society grappling with poverty, inequality, and limited options for women. They serve as a stark reminder of the importance of social safety nets, access to healthcare, and reproductive rights. Thinking about these difficult things shines a light on just how different and how very similar their lives were to our own. And hopefully, it encourages us to learn from the mistakes of the past and build a more compassionate future. It is important to note that this segment contains some disturbing details and may not be suitable for all viewers. Alright, so let's gently wade into the world of wet nursing. Imagine you're a medieval woman, you've just given birth, and well, frankly, the thought of being pregnant again soon is less than appealing. Spacing out your pregnancies wasn't just about convenience, it was often a matter of survival for both you and your child. Breastfeeding, as we've touched on, was understood, at least on some level, to delay the return of fertility, a phenomenon we now call lactational amenorrhea. But breastfeeding is demanding, and sometimes a mother couldn't or didn't want to nurse her own child exclusively. Maybe she was ill, maybe she worked long hours in the fields, or maybe, let's be honest, she just didn't enjoy it. Enter the wet nurse. Wet nursing, simply put, is when a woman other than the biological mother breastfeeds a child. It wasn't a new invention in the medieval period. It's been around for, well, pretty much as long as humans have. Think of it as a kind of pre-industrial baby outsourcing, a way to ensure the little one got fed, and mom could, in theory, space out those pregnancies. Now, why was wet nursing such a big deal? Well, for one, infant mortality was tragically high. Breast milk was often the safest, and sometimes only, source of nutrition for infants. So if a mother couldn't provide milk, finding a wet nurse could literally be the difference between life and death. But here's where things get a bit, shall we say, complicated. Wet nursing wasn't just about practicality, it was also wrapped up in social status, moral anxieties, and a whole lot of interesting, often conflicting beliefs. For the wealthy, hiring a wet nurse was a status symbol. It showed you had the means to delegate the messy, time-consuming business of childcare. A noble woman wasn't expected to be tied down to constant feedings. That was for the lower classes. It also meant that she could resume her social life, participate in courtly duties, and, fulfill her marital obligations, which, let's face it, were all about producing heirs. But it wasn't just the nobility dabbling in wet nursing. Even among the merchant classes, it was relatively common for women to employ wet nurses if they could afford it. Think of it as a way to get back to business quickly. A woman running a shop or managing a household needed to be available, and a baby constantly demanding her attention could be a serious impediment. Now, the church, as you can imagine, had some thoughts on all of this. On the one hand, they encouraged breastfeeding as a natural maternal duty. Mothers were supposed to nurture their children with their own bodies. It was seen as a sacred act. On the other hand, they also understood the realities of life and the need to ensure infants were fed. This led to a whole bunch of moral debates. Some theologians argued that a mother who abandoned her child to a wet nurse was neglecting her God-given duty and risking her child's spiritual well-being. The milk, they believed, transmitted not just nourishment, but also the wet nurse's character and virtues, or lack thereof. So you had to be really careful about who you chose. And that's where the anxieties really kicked in. People worried about the potential for tainted milk. If the wet nurse was of questionable character, if she was ill, or if she was breastfeeding other children, there were fears that the infant would be negatively affected. There were stories galore about children who grew up with the wet nurse's supposed traits, becoming, say, overly fond of drink, if the wet nurse had a fondness for ale. Superstitions and old wives' tales. Oh, you bet. Choosing a wet nurse was therefore a serious business. People looked for women who were healthy, morally upright, and of good temperament. Ideally, she would have recently given birth herself, ensuring a fresh supply of milk. Sometimes, elaborate contracts were drawn up, outlining the wet nurse's duties, diet, and even her sexual behavior. Imagine having that conversation. And here's another wrinkle. The relationship between the wet nurse and the child could be incredibly complex. In many cases, the wet nurse would live with the family, becoming a surrogate mother figure. This could create intense bonds of affection, but also jealousy and resentment. What happens when the wet nurse's own child needs her? Whose needs come first? It was a recipe for drama. Now let's not forget the complications from a pregnancy avoidance perspective. Wet nursing could extend the period of lactational amenorrhea, delaying the return of menstruation and fertility. But it wasn't a guarantee. The effectiveness depended on several factors, including how frequently the child was nursed, the wet nurse's own body, and the introduction of supplementary foods. And of course, there was the potential for abuse. Some wet nurses, driven by poverty or desperation, might take on more children than they could properly feed, diluting the milk or resorting to other less than ideal practices. Infant abandonment was a stark reality of the medieval period, and wet nursing, while intended to help, could sometimes be exploited. So, wet nursing in the medieval period was a far cry from the clean, sterile image we might have today. It was a complex social practice fraught with moral anxieties, social pressures, and very real risks. It was a way to space out pregnancies, yes, but it also came with a whole host of complications, highlighting the challenges and compromises women faced in managing their fertility and their lives in a very different world. It's a fascinating glimpse into the messy reality of medieval family life. Okay, so we've talked about some of the, shall we say, creative methods that medieval folks used to prevent pregnancy. And a lot of it, well, it wasn't exactly based on sound science. But what did the actual doctors of the time think? What did the medical texts say about contraception? Let's dive in. Now, before we start, it's important to remember that medieval medicine was different, like really different. We're talking about a world where the humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile were believed to control your health, and bloodletting was a go-to treatment for just about anything. So yeah, take everything you hear with a grain of salt, a big grain of salt, maybe a whole salt lick. The primary source for medical knowledge at the time was the Corpus Hippocraticum, a collection of ancient Greek medical texts, along with the writings of Galen, a Roman physician. These texts were translated, reinterpreted, and added to over the centuries, forming the basis of medical education in medieval Europe. So what did these guys have to say about family planning? Well, the short answer is not a whole lot. Remember, the church held a lot of sway, and any talk of preventing conception was, shall we say, frowned upon. Physicians were often in a tricky position, balancing their medical knowledge with the prevailing religious and social norms. However, that doesn't mean they were completely silent on the matter. Some medical texts did discuss ways to influence fertility, both to promote and sometimes to discourage conception. This was often framed as addressing imbalances or weaknesses in the womb, rather than outright contraception. It's all about the wording, right? For example, some texts suggested that certain herbs could make the womb slippery or hostile to seed. These herbs, like rue, pennyroyal, and savin, were often the same ones used in women's folk remedies, hinting at a connection between formal medical knowledge and traditional practices. Interestingly, physicians often focused on regulating menstruation. Irregular or absent periods were seen as a sign of imbalance, and various remedies were prescribed to restore regularity. And conveniently, some of these remedies also had abortifacient properties. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. The line between regulating periods and inducing abortions was often blurry, and physicians likely knew this. Now let's talk about some specific methods mentioned in medical texts. Pessaries, which are basically suppositories inserted into the vagina, were a common recommendation. These pessaries could be made from a variety of ingredients, including herbs, oils, and even things like honey and cabbage. The idea was that these pessaries could either block the sperm from reaching the egg or alter the environment of the vagina to make it less hospitable. Some texts also discussed the use of sponges soaked in vinegar or other acidic substances. These sponges were inserted into the vagina before intercourse to act as a barrier and kill sperm. Sound familiar? It's a primitive version of a spermicidal sponge, centuries before modern science. And what about men? Did physicians offer any advice for them? Well, not as much as for women, but there were some suggestions. Some texts claimed that certain foods or herbs could reduce a man's libido or even make him temporarily sterile. These remedies were often aimed at monks or other men who had taken vows of celibacy, but they could also have been used by married men who wanted to limit their family size. However, it's important to remember that a lot of this knowledge was based on speculation and observation, rather than actual scientific understanding. Physicians often relied on the doctrine of signatures, the belief that the appearance of a plant could indicate its medicinal properties. For example, if a plant had seeds that resembled testicles, it was thought to be beneficial for male fertility. Makes sense, right? And of course there was the ever-popular practice of astrology. The position of the planets and stars was believed to influence fertility and conception. So, a physician might advise a couple to avoid intercourse during certain astrological periods or to try to conceive when the stars were more favorable. But the thing is, a lot of the specific recommendations were vague, like, take this herb with wine, but not how much herb or what kind of wine. This vagueness might have been intentional. It allowed physicians to offer advice without explicitly condoning contraception, and it also gave them a bit of wiggle room if the treatment didn't work. Oh, well, you probably didn't use the correct wine. And let's be honest, a lot of these methods probably didn't work, but the belief in them, the placebo effect, the hope, that could have been powerful in itself. Plus, many of the recommended herbs did have some physiological effects, even if they weren't directly contraceptive. They might have affected hormone levels, uterine contractions, or even just overall health, which could indirectly influence fertility. Ultimately, the medical texts of the Middle Ages offer a fascinating glimpse into the complex and often contradictory attitudes towards fertility and family planning. Physicians were caught between the demands of the church, the traditions of folk medicine, and their own limited scientific understanding. They offered advice, sometimes cautiously, sometimes vaguely, but always with an awareness of the delicate balance between medical knowledge and social norms. And you know what? Not a whole lot has changed. Alright, so now that we've gotten the, shall we say, less glamorous aspects of medieval pregnancy prevention out of the way, things like pulling out and hoping for the best, let's talk about how people actually knew about these methods. I mean, it's not like they had access to WebMD, right? This brings us to a fascinating problem: the spread of knowledge in a world where most people couldn't read or write. We're talking about a largely illiterate population, folks. Books, luxury items, handwritten and painstakingly copied. So, how did this information get around? How did women, and let's be honest, they were the primary custodians of this kind of knowledge, learn about herbal remedies, contraceptive methods, and even the best ways to induce a miscarriage if necessary? The answer, as with so much of the medieval world, is complicated and relies on a combination of oral traditions and, well, a little bit of written stuff. Let's start with the big one: oral tradition. Picture this: you're a peasant woman living in a small village. You grow up surrounded by other women, your mother, your aunts, your neighbors. These women share a wealth of knowledge passed down through generations. It's a knowledge base built on experience, observation, and a healthy dose of trial and error. This wasn't a formal curriculum, mind you. It was integrated into daily life. Imagine sitting around the fire at night, shelling peas or spinning wool. The older women might share stories, interspersed with practical advice. Old Maggie used tansy tea to bring on her monthly flow, one might say. Or never trust a midwife who doesn't know her way around a patch of pennyroyal. These weren't just idle tales. They were valuable lessons encoded in stories and shared within the safety and intimacy of female communities. Think of it like a really, really long game of telephone, except instead of a whispered sentence, it's centuries of accumulated wisdom. And like telephone, things could get distorted over time. Remedies could become less effective. Dosages could get confused, or entirely new superstitions could get woven in along the way. This reliance on oral tradition also meant that knowledge was often localized. What worked in one village might be completely unknown in the next. The plants available, the specific ailments common in the region, the local customs, all of these factors shaped the knowledge base of a particular community. This explains why you find such a wide variety of remedies and practices across different parts of medieval Europe. There wasn't a single standardized approach. It was all very, very regional. Now, let's shift gears and talk about written records. Okay, so most people couldn't read. True, but books did exist, and some people could read, and they often held positions of power and influence. Think of physicians, apothecaries, and even some members of the clergy. These folks had access to written texts, often in Latin or Greek, that contained medical and scientific information. These texts, however, weren't exactly your modern-day medical textbooks. They were often filled with a mixture of accurate observations, ancient theories, and, well, let's just say some pretty bizarre ideas. Think along the lines of the four humors needing to be kept in balance, and prescribing things like bloodletting to help achieve that balance. Small sigh, these texts, while not always reliable, did play a role in shaping medical knowledge in the Middle Ages. Physicians, for example, might consult these books to diagnose illnesses and prescribe treatments. Apothecaries, who prepared and sold medicines, would use them to learn about different herbs and their properties. The thing is, the information in these texts wasn't always readily available to the average person, especially women. Latin was the language of scholarship, and women were often excluded from formal education. However, some medical texts were translated into the vernacular languages, French, English, German, etc., making them more accessible to a wider audience. And that's where things get interesting. Because even if women couldn't read these texts themselves, they might have access to them indirectly. A literate family member, a husband, a brother, a son, could read aloud from a medical book, sharing information about different ailments and remedies. Sometimes they might even try to interpret these texts for their female relatives, often filtering the information through their own beliefs and understanding. Furthermore, there's growing archaeological evidence that some women were in fact literate, even if they weren't part of the formal scholarly circles. Nuns, for example, often received a basic education, including reading and writing. And noble women, particularly those in positions of power, sometimes had access to tutors and libraries. These women could have played a role in translating and disseminating medical knowledge, adapting it for use in their own households and communities. But here's a key difference between oral traditions and written records: authority. Oral traditions derived their authority from the accumulated experience of generations. It was a communal knowledge, validated by practical results. Written records, on the other hand, derived their authority from the text itself, from the prestige of the author, the reputation of the institution that produced it, and the perceived wisdom of the ancients. This difference in authority could lead to conflicts between traditional folk knowledge and the more scientific knowledge found in books. A physician, for example, might dismiss a woman's herbal remedy as superstitious nonsense, even if it had been used effectively for generations. These sorts of conflicts played out again and again, highlighting the tension between different forms of knowledge and different sources of authority in the medieval world. So ultimately, the spread of knowledge about pregnancy prevention in the Middle Ages was a complex interplay of oral traditions, written records, and the social dynamics of the time. Women relied heavily on the wisdom passed down through generations, while physicians and apothecaries consulted written texts, often in Latin, for more scientific information. These two sources of knowledge weren't always in agreement, and the access to each depended greatly on factors like social class, literacy, and geographical location. Alright, let's settle in and dive into some real-life examples of how medieval families navigated this whole pregnancy thing. It's easy to get caught up in the theories and methods, but what did it actually look like for people living back then? Now, finding specific detailed records of individual families is, shall we say, a challenge. Medieval record keeping wasn't exactly focused on, documenting every bedroom decision, but by piecing together information from wills, court records, church documents, and the occasional personal letter, we can start to paint a picture. First up, let's consider the Fitzwilliam family of Yorkshire, England, in the 14th century. Sir Thomas Fitzwilliam was a knight, a landowner, and based on the records, a pretty busy guy. He and his wife, Lady Margaret, had a household to run, lands to manage, and, crucially, a family to provide for. Wills and land records suggest they had 4 surviving children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. Now this might not seem like a particularly small family, but consider the context. Average family sizes could be significantly larger, and infant mortality rates were brutal. So how did the Fitzwilliams manage their family size? Well, we can't say for sure, but a few clues emerge. Lady Margaret was known to be a devout woman, actively involved in the local church. This might suggest a tendency towards periods of abstinence, especially during Lent and other religious observances. Remember, the church, while promoting procreation, also emphasized the importance of controlling carnal desires. It's a bit of a tightrope walk, right? Furthermore, Sir Thomas was frequently away from home, engaged in military duties, or attending to matters of business in London. This inherent separation would naturally limit the opportunities for conception. Distance makes the heart grow fonder, but it also makes babies less likely, at least in a time before Zoom calls. It's fascinating how the social and political landscape of the time directly impacted the domestic sphere. Also, it's likely, given their social status, that Lady Margaret breastfed her children. While not foolproof, lactational amenorrhea, the temporary infertility that can occur while breastfeeding, would have offered some spacing between pregnancies. It's nature's way of providing a little breathing room, though I'm sure they didn't think of it that way. It was just how things were done. Now let's switch gears and head over to a different social class. Imagine a peasant family in rural France, perhaps the family of Jean and Alain, in the same era. Their lives would have been drastically different from the Fitzwilliams. Jean was a tenant farmer, working the land for a lord, while Alain tended to the home, garden and livestock. Surviving records about peasant families are even scarcer, but we can infer a few things. Jean and Alais likely married relatively late, perhaps in their early 20s. This delay in marriage, common among the peasantry due to economic constraints and the need to accumulate resources, would naturally reduce the number of potential childbearing years. Their family size was probably larger than the Fitzwilliams, perhaps 5 or 6 surviving children. This reflects the economic realities of peasant life. Children were valuable assets, providing labor for the farm and support for their parents in old age. However, with more children comes more mouths to feed, and the risks of childbirth were ever present. It's highly probable that Alais possessed knowledge of traditional herbal remedies. Passed down through generations of women, these remedies were used to treat a variety of ailments, including, potentially, the regulation of fertility. We have to be delicate here, because proving whether a plant was specifically used for abortion is hard, but the evidence strongly suggests women controlled their fertility. Furthermore, coitus interruptus, or withdrawal, was almost certainly practiced. While the church condemned it, the lack of other readily available options made it a common, if unreliable, method. Imagine the discussions, or perhaps lack thereof, around that in the dimly lit cottage. Now let's examine a slightly different angle, the role of religious communities. Consider the case of a nunnery in Germany during the 15th century. While nuns were of course vowed to celibacy, the rules weren't always strictly followed. Scandalous, I know. Church records occasionally hint at pregnancies within convents, leading to investigations, and sometimes the abandonment of infants. These instances highlight the contradictions inherent in the medieval church's teachings on sexuality. Celibacy was idealized, but human nature often proved to be a powerful force. The question is, how did these nuns attempt to avoid detection and maintain their vows? We can speculate that they may have had access to herbal remedies or other methods of terminating pregnancies, though such practices would have been strictly forbidden. It's a dark and often overlooked corner of medieval history. And finally, what about noble families who wanted to limit their children? Consider the Valois dynasty in France in the 14th century. As kings and queens, these people had a lot of influence, but they also had something to prove. Sometimes a son and an heir wasn't enough. There was enormous pressure to continue to produce, and when kings strayed from their marital beds, they often needed to be discreet. The case of Agnes Sorel and Charles VII is perhaps the most intriguing. As the king's mistress, she had children by him, but Charles also had children with his wife. While we don't know much about the Valois dynasty habits, we can surmise that diet and nutrition played a role. Poor nutrition can make people infertile, and if they weren't already infertile, perhaps certain potions would do the trick. In these particular cases, we don't know, but we can guess. These case studies, though incomplete, offer a glimpse into the varied experiences of medieval families. From knightly households to peasant cottages to religious communities, the methods of pregnancy avoidance were shaped by social class, religious beliefs, economic constraints, and individual circumstances. It's important to remember that there was no one-size-fits-all solution. Medieval people were resourceful, adaptable, and above all, driven by the same desires and anxieties that we experience today. They were trying to navigate complex issues with limited knowledge, and often with significant risk. And frankly, it's amazing they managed as well as they did. Alright, so before we really dive into how medieval couples actually navigated the whole, baby-making situation, we've got to clear the air a little. There's a ton of stuff floating around out there about medieval sexuality that's just wrong, like cartoonishly wrong. We're gonna gently dismantle some of those myths, okay? Think of it as weeding the garden before we plant the good stuff. First up, the Dark Ages myth. The idea that everyone in the Middle Ages was repressed, terrified of sex, and basically just walking around in sackcloth, beating themselves with flagella. It's a persistent image, and honestly, it's just not accurate. Now, did the church have a pretty strong opinion on sex? Absolutely, we'll get into that. but that doesn't mean everyone followed the rules. Humans are humans, right? The thing is, our view of medieval sexuality is often filtered through centuries of later interpretations, Victorian prudishness, and well, a general misunderstanding of the sources. We tend to focus on the sermons and the legal codes that condemned certain behaviors, and forget about the far more interesting, far more human stuff that was actually happening. Think about it, you have these amazing illuminated manuscripts, filled with these really cheeky marginal illustrations, naughty little scenes tucked away in the borders, far from the serious religious text. You're not going to see something like that from a society as prim as we imagine. We also have bawdy poems and songs, stories filled with lust and intrigue. It's not all doom and gloom, folks. There's a very real, sometimes really earthy sense of humor. And hey, if you look at the architecture, there are gargoyles and Sheila na gigs everywhere. Now the church's perspective. Yes, they weren't exactly throwing sex parties. The ideal, at least officially, was procreation within marriage. Sex was for making babies, end of story. Anything else, sex outside of marriage, different sexual acts within marriage that weren't specifically aimed at reproduction, that was considered sinful. But, and this is a huge but, the church also recognized the importance of marriage itself. Marriage was a sacrament, a sacred bond, and that meant that couples had a duty to maintain their relationship, which includes the physical aspect. There was a whole very serious legal framework in place to uphold marital rights and duties. If one partner was consistently refusing to have sex, that could actually be grounds for annulment. That's a far cry from the image of complete sexual repression, right? Another thing to consider, the idea that people back then were ignorant about their bodies, or just didn't experience sexual pleasure. That's also wrong. Medieval medical texts, though often wildly inaccurate by modern standards, contain detailed descriptions of the human body, including the sexual organs, and more importantly, they recognize that women could experience pleasure during sex, and that this pleasure was actually important for conception. They actually thought it helped the semen reach its target, and women were writing about their experiences too. Okay, maybe not in explicit detail all that often, but look at the writings of women like Hildegard of Bingen or Heloise d'Argenteau. These women were obviously intelligent, passionate, and very aware of their own desires. There are other sources too, books of hours and other devotional texts. These give us some insight into the thoughts of everyday people in the later Middle Ages. There are also court cases in which people report rape or sexual assault. They weren't ignorant or unfeeling automatons. So where does this myth of the sexually repressed Middle Ages come from? Well, like a lot of historical myths, it's complicated. Part of it is the focus on those official pronouncements from the church, ignoring the everyday realities. Part of it is the projection of later anxieties about sex onto the past. And part of it is just plain old snobbery. The idea that people in the past were somehow less sophisticated or less intelligent than we are today. Another myth we really have to squash is that medieval people were constantly pregnant and dying in childbirth. Now, pregnancy was dangerous. Infant mortality rates were incredibly high too, and childbirth was a leading cause of death for women. No arguing with that. But that doesn't mean that women were just constantly popping out babies, one after another. They weren't trying to have 20 children. We'll dive into the various methods they used to try and avoid pregnancy later, but the fact that they were trying is important. It shows that they weren't just passively accepting whatever fate threw at them. They were actively trying to control their own fertility, to manage their own lives. And let's be real, medieval women were some tough cookies. Even with all the risks, they kept going. And let's quickly address a final persistent misconception, the whole rite of the first night thing. Just prima noctis. The idea that a lord had the right to sleep with a peasant bride on her wedding night. It's a really popular trope in movies and TV, but historians generally agree that it's almost entirely fictional. There's very little actual evidence to support it. It might have existed in some isolated cases, or as a symbolic custom, but it certainly wasn't a widespread practice. The truth is, medieval sexuality was complex, nuanced, and often contradictory. It wasn't all about repression and ignorance. It was about people trying to navigate their desires, their relationships, and their lives within the social and religious constraints of their time. And that's a lot more interesting, and a lot more human than the myths would have you believe. Okay, now we can get on with the real juicy stuff. So we've wandered through centuries, peered into societal norms, and even dabbled in a bit of herbal lore. But what does it all mean? What can we definitively say about how medieval couples navigated the tricky waters of pregnancy avoidance? Well, the truth is, there's no single simple answer. It's not like they had a readily available box of condoms on the nightstand, now is it? The landscape of medieval pregnancy avoidance was, above all, complex. We're talking about a world before widespread scientific understanding of reproduction. A world where the church held immense power, dictating moral codes while simultaneously struggling to control human desires. A world where women held ancient knowledge, passed down through generations, often shrouded in secrecy and tinged with superstition. This complexity means we can't just point to one method and say, that's how they did it. It was a patchwork of different approaches, varying by region, social class, religious belief, and individual knowledge. One peasant woman might rely solely on breastfeeding to space out her pregnancies, while a noble woman might experiment with a variety of pessaries and herbal concoctions. And a lot of people were just crossing their fingers, and it was varied. The methods employed ranged from the practical coitus interruptus, abstinence, breastfeeding, to the somewhat dubious herbal remedies with questionable efficacy, amulets, and incantations. There was no single medieval contraceptive. Instead, there was a collection of practices, some more effective than others, and often used in combination. Then there's the role of the church, adding another layer of intricacy. Officially, the church condemned contraception, viewing procreation as the primary purpose of marriage. But in reality, the church's stance was often more nuanced. Confessors might turn a blind eye to certain practices, particularly in cases where pregnancy posed a significant risk to the woman's health. And, well, people are going to people. So regardless of doctrine, the dance continued. Let's not forget women's knowledge, the unsung heroes of medieval family planning, passed down through oral traditions. This knowledge encompassed everything from herbal remedies to techniques for using pessaries and sponges. These women possessed a deep understanding of their bodies and the natural world around them. Even if that understanding wasn't always scientifically accurate, they were the original DIY experts. We have to acknowledge the limitations of our understanding too. Much of what we know about medieval pregnancy avoidance comes from fragmented sources, medical texts, court records, religious treatises, and archaeological findings. And a lot of it just wasn't written down because who would admit something like that to a cleric or scribe? We're relying on whispers, inferences, and piecing together fragments of information to reconstruct a picture of the past. Furthermore, it's important to remember that pregnancy and childbirth were incredibly dangerous for medieval women. Maternal mortality rates were shockingly high, and many women died from complications related to pregnancy and childbirth. This stark reality meant that pregnancy avoidance wasn't just about limiting family size, it was often about survival, and desperate circumstances bred desperate measures. We also saw how factors like disease, famine, and social class all influenced fertility rates and pregnancy avoidance practices. Plagues and famines decimated populations, impacting birth rates and altering societal attitudes towards reproduction. And the availability of food and resources varied drastically between social classes, affecting both fertility and access to different methods of pregnancy avoidance. A peasant woman might not have access to the same herbal remedies as a noble woman, for example. It's easy to romanticize or demonize the past, to assume that medieval people were either ignorant and helpless or cunning and resourceful. But the reality is far more complex. They were people just like us, navigating difficult circumstances with the knowledge and resources available to them. They were trying to make the best choices they could in a world that was often unforgiving and unpredictable. So next time you reach for your preferred method of contraception, take a moment to appreciate the journey that humanity has taken to get here. From the murky depths of medieval herbal lore to the sterile efficiency of modern medicine, the quest to control our fertility has been a long and winding road, and who knows what the future holds. Maybe someday, we'll look back on our current methods with the same mixture of fascination and bemusement that we feel towards the medieval attempts to sleep with the enemy without conceiving. And as a final thought, let's ditch any lingering notions of the good old days. In many ways, we are incredibly lucky to have the options we do for family planning and pregnancy prevention. So appreciate the fact that we can discuss these issues openly. Appreciate the knowledge that we have regarding our reproductive systems. And above all, appreciate the choices that we can make regarding our reproductive health. Now go have a good night's sleep, and maybe dream about something a little less complicated than medieval contraception. Okay.